Hey guys, and welcome to the Moms and Mysteries podcast, a true crime podcast featuring myself, Mandy, and my dear friend, Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Mandy. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We've been doing this series this month. We've only had one episode released, and man, we've gotten some amazing messages and comments, and I don't know, it's
Really
been very, very
positive
nice.
feedback.
Yeah, it's not like that we need it. It just feels like we're doing something that's helpful, and that's always, that's the goal, right? Yeah, and so still thinking of people in the process of dealing with this hurricane that it feels like never ending. Every day there's more terrible, terrible updates, and the death
Devastation.
toll keeps rising. Yeah, it's unreal. So we're still thinking of you guys. We actually did post on our Instagram some ways you can help out if you'd like to. And so that's there. I'm sure you've seen other things, but there's some like boots on the ground people that are actually actively working in the areas, if you want to check that out.
So it is the second week of October, and as we've been mentioning, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and all month long we are highlighting stories involving domestic violence to bring awareness to what is a very real and very scary reality that up to a third of women have or will experience at some point in their life. We are eager to continue our campaign to share not only these stories of these victims, but also to spread the word that if you are experiencing any form of domestic violence, you aren't alone, and there are resources and support out there to help you navigate a path to safety. So we will have some of those resources to share at the end of the episode, and of course, we will have them in our show notes as well. Today, the story we're discussing is a little bit different. While it is a story of domestic violence, the ending isn't what you might expect, but not necessarily in a bad way. The story of Francine Hughes is an important one to tell because it's actually a case that led to some of the most increased awareness efforts around the topic of domestic violence, and that, of course, led to changes in domestic violence laws. This episode does contain some detailed descriptions of abuse and the types of things that would set the abuser in the story off, so keep that in mind if that type of content is upsetting for you. And there is also a quick mention of animal abuse in this episode as well.
On August 17th, 1947, Francine Moran Hughes was born in Stockbridge, Michigan, into a family that grew to include 6 children in total. Francine's father was a farm laborer, and we can assume her mom, Hazel, was a homemaker. Hazel actually named Francine after a French musician that she liked. Home life was not ideal for Francine and her siblings because her dad would often drink and become physically abusive towards Hazel, though he really didn't even need alcohol to be abusive. It was just worse when he did drink. When Francine was just 9 years old, she endured a heartbreaking tragedy that would stay with her for life on her 3-year-old brother. At some point, Francine was helping her mom hang laundry, and her little brother wandered off and was hit by a car.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Thankfully, the little boy survived, but he had broken arms and other injuries. Unfortunately, Francine's mom placed a huge burden of guilt on her and would tell Francine that it was actually her fault for not watching her brother more closely, and she's literally 9 years old at this point. But this guilt over what happened was something Francine would carry for years to come.
I cannot imagine that whole scenario. And obviously, it's not Francine's fault. You know, she was also a child herself, but just, oh my gosh. I can't imagine.
No, a similar thing happened in my family. It did not end as well, not like immediate family. And the person just dealt with this guilt forever. Like it's still with them, and it just, you can't.
I can't
and they were a
imagine
kid, and they were a kid. Like
it
should have never been on them.
It always makes me think of the beginning scene in Pet Sematary. Have you seen that? No.
It's scary.
It has a scene where that happens. You know, a child runs off, and it like wasn't, no one was paying attention, and that happens, and awful. But you can see how that happening when Francine was 9. You can see how that would easily cause a lasting impression.
Absolutely. But by the time that Francine was 15, she was showing interest in boys. One boy in particular that she took a liking to was 18-year-old James Mickey Hughes. He was a tall, slim guy with thick black hair and bluish-green eyes, and even though he and his brother were known for being troublemakers, they were always in fights and always having run-ins with the law, Francine was drawn to him. She thought he seemed sophisticated because he owned a car, which wasn't a common thing among the people she knew. When she was 16, Francine dropped out of school, and a month later, she and Mickey got married and moved in with his parents. But there was no honeymoon phase to speak of. Almost immediately after the wedding, the abuse began when her new husband accused her of dressing inappropriately and tearing off her clothes. Weeks later, the couple had some visitors over to their house, including a man that Francine had never met before. Later on, Mickey confronted Francine in their bedroom and accused her of oogling the man. Francine told Mickey that she wasn't looking at him like that. She was just looking at his hands because she'd never seen someone with such big hands. In response to this, Mickey punched her and knocked her onto the bed. Francine pleaded with him to stop, but it wasn't until Mickey's father heard the commotion and came into the room and intervened that it stopped. Mickey ended up breaking a chair and threatening his father, so his mom called the police. When officers arrived, Mickey tried to fight them too, and he wound up getting himself arrested. Sadly, though, this wouldn't be the last of the violence that Francine would face in her marriage, but it would be the last time that Mickey's parents ever intervened.
As time went on, Francine tried to rationalize her husband's physical and emotional abuse by telling herself that it was somehow her fault and that she must have done something wrong to make him so angry. She started to feel trapped, isolated, and powerless, and her self-esteem dwindled. Many times, Francine would try to leave Mickey, but it was always short-lived. They eventually had 4 kids together, but there was one time that she was trying to leave him while she was pregnant with one of them, and when she returned to her parents' home, her mom actually forced her to go back to Mickey, which you have to take into account kind of like the nuances of a particular situation, and we know from the research that Francine's mom was also in an abusive marriage with Francine's father, so it might not sound like something that you would do to tell your child to go back to an abusive situation, but if her mom is also experiencing the same thing.
It's what she knew.
Exactly. It's different than what other people might choose. So without the support of her family or really society as a whole, Francine found herself trapped in the cycle of abuse. She tried to help herself by seeing a counselor for advice, and even though the counselor did suggest assertiveness training, Francine felt really defeated. She felt like there was no point in that and that there was no way she was ever going to actually be able to assert herself over someone who was as strong and as physically violent as Mickey was. She felt hopeless at that point, and that was partly due to there just not really being any outside resources for people that were in situations like Francine's. Domestic violence shelters didn't even exist at the time, so she truly had nowhere else to turn. One of Francine's daughters, Nicole, later said that the beatings and the abuse at the hands of her father was an everyday thing. She said they were all miserable in that house, but her mom was strong, and the kids never went without anything that they needed. And we have so much more to get into after a quick break to hear a word from this week's sponsors.
With school back in session and homework piling up, the last thing I want to do at the end of the day is figure out what's for dinner. Thankfully, Hungry Root takes that stress right off my plate. No more scrambling to plan breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day. It's been a total lifesaver as I try to keep up with the back-to-school chaos. Hungry Root doesn't just handle meal planning. They tailor meals to your family's health goals, dietary needs, and even how much time you've got to cook. And if you're like me, the mental load of actually planning one more meal can feel like too much. And that's where Hungry Root shines. They send high-quality groceries, easy-to-make recipes, and even essential supplements straight to your door. Delivery day is a huge win in my house. There's always new, healthy snacks and real meals that my family will actually eat. We recently tried the cheesy chicken pesto tortellini. It's fresh, flavorful, on the table in under 10 minutes without me having to stress about dinner.
Right now, Hungry Root is offering Moms and Mysteries listeners 40% off your first delivery and free veggies for life. Just go to hungryroot.com/moms to get 40% off your first delivery and get your free veggies. That's hungryroot.com/moms. Don't forget to use our link so they know we sent you.
This message is sponsored by Greenlight. As our kids get older, some things about parenting do actually get a little easier. You can finally reason with them most of the time, unless I guess it's a teenager, and they can even clean up after themselves. Sort of. But other things like having those conversations about money don't really get easier. The truth is, kids won't really understand how to manage money until they're actually in charge of it. And that's where Greenlight comes in. Greenlight is a debit card and money app designed for families. Parents can send money to their kids and keep an eye on how they're spending and saving their money while kids and teens learn the essentials of managing their finances. It's a great way to build their confidence and teach lifelong money skills. One of my favorite features, and my son really loves this, is the Greenlight app's games that teach kids how to save, invest, and spend responsibly, but it's all in a fun and engaging way. Plus, the chores feature is really a game changer for keeping our house in order. I just set up the chores and even schedule some of them to be recurring, and it rewards my kids with allowance for completing them. And believe me, my kids are much more motivated to do their chores when they aren't waiting around for me to go get cash from the bank. I deposit it directly into their account. I can only imagine how much more motivated I would have been to clean my room if I had money deposited into my account when I was done. And it's an easy, convenient way to teach them how to handle money responsibly. Trust me, it makes navigating family life a whole lot smoother.
Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/moms. That's greenlight.com/moms to try Greenlight for free. Greenlight.com/moms.
And now back to the episode. Before the break, we were talking about the story of Francine Hughes, a woman who was trapped in an abusive marriage with her husband, Mickey. And despite multiple attempts for her to leave, the lack of resources for battered women at the time made it nearly impossible for Francine and her children to escape the nightmare they were living every day. By the time Francine was pregnant with her fourth child, Mickey was out of work and had taken up a heavier drinking habit, which only made matters worse. Francine had no money and no way to feed their kids, so out of desperation, she tried to apply for welfare, only to find out that the head of the family, the husband, was the only person who could actually request assistance. And in this case, that was Mickey, and he refused. However, when a welfare official saw the bruises on Francine's face, he suggested that she file for divorce and even gave her the necessary papers. Francine was actually surprised at how simple the process seemed, just filling out this form and paying $7, but there was one huge problem, and that was that she didn't have $7. The welfare official ended up giving her the money from his own pocket.
He's my favorite person in this whole story.
I know. That's such a small thing. I mean, $7 actually at the time was a lot, but for somebody to see a problem and say, I'm going to help this person, not expecting anything out of it, like, I don't know. It touched my heart that there was someone that was like, you got to get out. Francine was finally able to file for divorce and secure welfare assistance for herself and her kids. And even though she was pregnant at the time, Francine and the kids moved into an apartment. Then, when the baby was born, Mickey showed up at the hospital, claimed he was sober, and he wanted another chance. But Francine refused to entertain the idea, and Mickey left the hospital in a rage. In this rage, he's speeding away from the hospital, and he runs a red light and gets into a near-fatal accident, which left him hospitalized for the next 2 months. Unfortunately, even though Francine had nothing to do with this accident, she felt personally responsible and guilty that it happened, and after being pressured by Mickey's family, she decided to let him come stay with her and the kids. But she told herself that it was just temporary until he was well again. To me, this reminds me of her younger brother, right? Like, that was not her fault, but she carried the guilt, and I feel like that definitely left an impression.
Definitely, and I feel like that also played a role in why she may have taken it to heart so much, because she already has had this experience, and, you know, how could this happen again to someone? You know, it's just awful to even think about her blaming herself in these situations, and how that affected her decisions, you know, going forward.
Totally. So before long, Mickey was feeling better, but he didn't move out. He continued to stay at Francine's apartment and continued to physically and emotionally abuse her. Francine, who was now enduring abuse once again and supporting 4 kids on a welfare check, was trapped again. Mickey was unemployed and using up their money on alcohol, and there was barely enough food to feed the kids. He would threaten Francine, though, anytime she thought about leaving. He would say things like, "You ain't ever gonna get rid of me. I'll find you wherever you go, and when I do, it won't be pretty." He also told her he would kill her inch by inch.
Francine was totally desperate and determined to find a way to get herself and the kids out from under Mickey's violent reign of terror when this idea came to her to apply for an education grant. She hoped that getting some type of certification or a degree would lead to financial independence, and that would allow her to finally break free from Mickey for good. She got approved for the grant and enrolled in a secretarial school. On March 9th, 1977, after Francine got home from her classes, Mickey demanded that she leave and go to the store to buy something for dinner. So Francine did as he said and went to the grocery store and returned with TV dinners. But that wasn't what Mickey had in mind, and he completely flew off the handle. He was angry that she hadn't gotten something better, in his opinion. Mickey attacked Francine, and he pulled her hair and hit her in the head and mouth with his fist. In the midst of this violence, Francine screamed for her oldest daughter, Christy, to call the police, which she did. Before the police got there, Mickey told Francine she was never going to classes again, and he tore up her books and threw the pieces on the floor and then forced her to burn them. When the police finally arrived, they could clearly see that Francine had been battered, but at that time, police didn't make any arrests on misdemeanor crimes unless they personally saw the crime taking place. So even though it's very obvious that Francine is being abused, they wouldn't arrest Mickey unless they actually witnessed him hitting her themselves. So the police left, leaving the two of them together, Francine and Mickey, and Francine and the kids tried to go about their evening and just eat their dinners quietly. But Mickey came into the kitchen and told the kids to go upstairs to their rooms, and then he dumped their food all over the floor and ordered Francine to clean it up. A few minutes later, he picked up the trash can she was using to clean the mess and dumped it back onto the floor. As Francine was bending down to clean it up, Mickey wiped some of the garbage onto her back and into her hair and told her that things were going to be much, much worse now.
How can it be much worse? That has to be what she's thinking. Obviously, she's hoping it will get better at some point, but to be told it's going to only get worse, what do you do?
Some of this stuff is hard to hear and to read,
Sure.
that she was living through this as her reality and how terrifying that must be. And even just thinking about the kids and, they already are struggling to put food on the table. They don't have a lot to eat. And just to think of him taking his kids' food and dumping it on the floor. And, none of this is acceptable in any way. Like, it's just heartbreaking all around.
Yeah.
Mickey continued his attack and began hitting her again while their kids listened from upstairs in horror. And they would call out to Francine every once in a while asking if she was all right. When Mickey was done beating Francine, he went into their room to watch TV. But it wasn't long before he called out to Francine and ordered her to make him something to eat. So she made him a sandwich, which he did eat, and then he called her back into the room and demanded sex. Francine knew that if she tried to object, he would start hitting her again.
Eventually, Mickey fell asleep, and Francine fed the kids and waited for her youngest child to come home from a friend's house. At that point, Francine felt the only option she had left was to load the kids into her car and drive as far away as possible. She didn't even know where she was going to go. She just knew she had to get out of there. Francine told her kids to get dressed in their shoes and coats and get ready to escape. But then, as she stood there thinking about everything, another thought crept into her mind. She didn't want there to be anything for her to come back to. Keep in mind, she's tried to leave several times. So in her mind, if nothing's here, there's nothing
no
to come home to.
back, right?
Yeah. So Francine got her kids safely inside the car, and then she went back inside the house. She grabbed a can of gasoline and poured it around the bed where Mickey was passed out after a long night of his alcohol-fueled tirade. Without thinking twice, Francine struck a match and set the house on fire. Francine's daughter, Nicole, later said that she believed her mom did it to save them all. Not just herself, but her kids too. Nicole said of her dad, quote, "He was definitely on a path to kill us."
That is chilling.
It is. And sometimes we have heard in these stories where women are not able to leave or feel they can't leave until they see something happening to their kids and realize, we have to go.
Like
it's different when it's your kids than it's with you. And so I imagine even him throwing the kids' food away is just enough to realize like, oh, it's not just happening to me. Like it's beyond yourself now.
Right.
So after setting the fire, Francine did not take off in the car with her kids and head out of town. Instead, she drove immediately down to the sheriff's office and turned herself in. It was 8:46 p.m. on March 9th when she arrived, hysterical and sobbing uncontrollably. Francine was shaking as she told the officers, "I did it, I did it, I did it." And she immediately confessed about setting the bed on fire while her abusive husband, Mickey, was sleeping in it. And she said the house was probably still burning. The local fire departments were quickly notified and rushed to the scene, where they found the house nearly engulfed in flames, with almost half of the home already destroyed. The fire had spread to most of the structure and took some time to extinguish, but when it was safe to enter the charred remains of the house, they discovered the body of 31-year-old Mickey Hughes in the rubble just outside the bedroom. His cause of death was later determined to be asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. After his body was discovered, Francine was charged with first-degree murder and felony murder in connection with committing arson. She was booked in the county jail in Mason and arraigned the next day without bond. Soon after her arrest, different organizations in the area came together to form the Francine Hughes Defense Committee, which included representatives from Sisters for Human Equality, the Lansing chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, and the New American Movement. The committee actually released a statement saying in part, quote, "Francine is a symbol of the plight of battered women all over. Wife assault has been treated much like rape. The victim, and not the assailant, is put on the defense," end quote. A preliminary hearing was held in Ingham County, but her case was handed over to the circuit court, and Francine would spend 8 months in jail awaiting her trial.
Francine's trial began on October 24th, 1977, with a jury of 12 women and 2 men. The Francine Hughes Defense Committee and the feminist groups that formed it were hoping for a landmark decision and to change the legal interpretation of self-defense, specifically as it applied to women. Prosecutors argued that Francine had been having an affair with an unidentified man and that this was the real reason she set fire to the bed and killed her husband. They did not explain how this alleged love affair served as a motive for murder, but they did claim that a series of letters written by Francine from jail would make things more clear, and we'll get into a little bit more about those letters as we go on. The defense acknowledged that Francine did set fire to her own home, which killed her ex-husband while he slept, but that the crime was not premeditated. Her attorney said that whatever Francine did was done in the context of her experience as a battered woman who feared for her life. They emphasized that this was not an isolated incident at all, and that there had been a cycle of violence that had repeated itself over and over for years. And beyond that, Mickey had threatened to kill Francine on multiple occasions, including on the day that he died. A detective testified that they had reviewed department records and determined that the day of the fire was the first time authorities had even been called to the Hughes home. But the defense presented evidence that neighbors actually saw the police at the home pretty often, and there was at least one occasion where Francine had been beaten so severely that she had to go to the hospital. Francine's former classmate, Elizabeth Cover, testified for the prosecution and brought those letters from jail that we just mentioned. Elizabeth said that she saw Francine with a man named George Walkup in the school lounge, but she couldn't really recall how many times she had actually seen them together. Interestingly, George, who was 26 and worked at the school as a security guard, had died by suicide just a few weeks earlier. And when a police officer was cleaning out his locker, he found these letters from Francine. But at the time, the contents of the letters were not disclosed. Elizabeth also stated that Francine told her she didn't want to see George anymore because she found out that he was married and had a child.
Francine's 2 oldest children, Christy and James, also testified. Chrissy told the court that she was around 7 and in the 1st grade, the first time she could remember her dad hurting her mom. He had threatened to kill her several times and abused her more times than Christy could count. She even recalled a time that Mickey pulled a knife on Francine while all of the kids watched through the window, absolutely terrified. She also added that there were many times when Francine would take the kids to hide out at their paternal grandmother's house next door, which I forgot that they were living next door to his parents, who have now seen the police come to the house several times and clearly weren't doing anything.
But this kind of goes to show the cycle of abuse, an accepted behavior pattern, in his family that, then of course they're not going to intervene and they're not going to do anything.
Yeah. She gave more examples of things she witnessed growing up, including her dad ripping the phone out of the wall because Francine was using it when he told her not to, and another time where he took a sledgehammer to the toilet because it was leaking around the bottom, and he, of course, made Francine pay for the damage. He also locked their dog outside when it was below freezing and the dog was in labor. The dog and her puppies froze to death. The kids also told the court that on the day of the fire, their dad had been drinking heavily already by the time they got home from school. Their mom was at her classes, and when she got home, she went to the store to buy groceries. But when she got back, their dad was mad because he didn't want to eat TV dinners. Jimmy testified that he saw his dad hit his mom and yell at her with profanity. Chrissy said she called the police after her mom told her to, and then their dad ripped up Francine's school books and threw them on the floor. The police came, but after they left, their dad started beating their mom again and said if she ever called the police again, he would kill her. The kids said that after their dad fell asleep, their mom had them get dressed and get them settled in their car, then she went back inside for a little while. When she came back, she was crying and upset, and she drove to the police station. A clinical psychologist testified that Francine was temporarily insane when she started the fire that killed Mickey, explaining that Francine was at the mercy of her own impulses and something inside of her just snapped. He emphasized that she was not a violent person or a criminal at all, and that it was highly unlikely she would behave in this manner ever again. Francine testified in her own defense and said, quote, "I didn't really feel anything. It was like watching myself do the things I was doing. It was like watching my movements, but that was all," end quote. Francine said that as she was pouring the gasoline around the bed, there was a little voice in her head saying, "Do it, do it." So she kept pouring and then quickly lit a match. Francine said that after 13 years of beatings and threats, she couldn't take living in the type of fear that dominated her life every single day. She never knew what to expect when she came home from anywhere, and she was always afraid he was going to hurt her. She also said she felt like she couldn't even move without his permission. Francine also told the court that she'd asked for help from the police, the prosecutor's office, and the courts, but no one helped her. The police would break up fights, but they always said there wasn't anything they could do unless they witnessed the abuse themselves. Francine even visited the office of the judge in Jackson who granted her divorce looking for legal help. The judge wasn't there, but his secretary told Francine that she would have to leave her home and all of her possessions to get any help from the court. Francine also once attempted to have Mickey committed for psychological treatment, but when it was learned that he was actually a heavy drinker, officials turned him down. Later, after yet another one of Mickey's explosive, violent episodes where he tried to choke Francine and run her off the road, she sought a criminal warrant against him. But the prosecutor wouldn't do anything despite Francine's pleas and fear for her life. Francine detailed what happened on the day of the fire and talked about her brief relationship with George Walkup. She said she had slept with him one time, but when she found out he was still married, she ended the relationship. Despite this, she still exchanged letters with him while she was in jail. And we still have more to get into after one last break to hear word from this week's sponsors. I'm a bit of a foodie, especially when it comes to seafood. I see food and I eat it. Lame, but it's very, very true. And if there's one thing my kids inherited from me, it's their never-ending hunger. Feeding them feels like a full-time job sometimes. And if you're looking to make mealtime easier, check out our awesome partner, Nurture Life. Nurture Life's mission is simple: to help parents feed their kids from 10 months to 10 years old without the stress. As someone who once tried pureeing baby food for exactly 1 week, I can tell you Nurture Life is really a game changer. They offer healthy, balanced meals that kids actually love. Think like mac and cheese or spaghetti and meatballs. And there's fresh, never frozen ingredients that can be heated up in a jiffy. My son actually tried the chicken mac and cheese with the hidden squash and peas. Parenting tip, don't tell them there's hidden vegetables. He actually just dove into the mac and cheese, and I did a little victory dance inside because he was eating butternut squash without even realizing it. And if you've got mom guilt about what your kids are or aren't eating, let Nurture Life take away the worry so you can enjoy mealtime again. In addition to full meals, Nurture Life offers on-the-go snacks and superfood smoothies so kids can eat well no matter what they're craving. It's about time that a flexible meal subscription existed for babies and kids. So head to nurturelife.com and use code MOMS for 55% off your first order. That's right, 55% off. Once again, that's nurturelife.com for 55% off, and make sure you use our promo code MOMS so they know we sent you. It's been a while since I've had a baby of my own, and some days I miss it so much. The baby cuddles and baby smiles, but when it comes to diaper rashes, not so much. I remember the first time my oldest had a diaper rash, I was really devastated. Here's this tiny thing totally dependent on me, and now she's fussy and obviously uncomfortable, and I'm supposed to have the answers. Well, with time and treatment, it went away, but what I really wanted was to avoid it altogether. And now, baby butts rejoice. New Huggies Skin Essentials are here, a brand new dermatologist-approved line of diapers, wipes, and pull-ups training pants, all designed with baby's sensitive skin in mind.
The wipes are thick and have zero harsh ingredients for a great, gentle clean. Pull-Up Skin Essentials has got your big kid covered too, with a training pant that's ultra soft and breathable to help protect sensitive skin throughout potty training. Whether you're a first-time parent or a seasoned pro, make it easy on yourself and your baby with Huggies. Learn more at Huggies.com. Once again, head to Huggies.com to learn more.
And now back to the episode.
Before the break, we were talking about the trial of Francine Hughes after she set fire to the bed that her abusive husband was sleeping on. Francine testified that her actions were driven by years of fear and trauma, which led her to snapping and killing the man who abused her. After hearing testimony from 43 witnesses, the jury began deliberating over the 10 possible verdicts they had to consider, and these options ranged from not guilty to varying degrees of murder and manslaughter, or, of course, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. They also had the option to return a unique Michigan-specific verdict of guilty but mentally ill. After almost 5.5 hours, the jury came to their decision. They found Francine not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict required Francine to undergo a psych evaluation by a state-appointed psychiatrist to determine whether or not she would need further treatment at an inpatient mental health facility. Francine broke down in tears when the verdict was read and hugged her children, and she said, "Maybe now they will understand. When a woman, man, or child says I'm being abused, maybe they won't close the door." Francine did complete her psychiatric evaluation, which found that she was sane, and after that, she was completely free. In the following years, Francine worked hard to try and rebuild her life. She took a job as a secretary and then as a forklift operator. But the weight of her past traumas still lingered, and she later told People magazine that her life really felt out of control at this time. Francine was partying and drinking heavily, and she was also taking speed. She said it was like she was trying to actually self-destruct. Eventually, she got laid off from the factory, and she met a man named Robert Wilson, and he had been released from prison recently after serving 10 years of what was supposed to be a 30-year sentence for armed robbery. They got married, but Francine's kids didn't like Robert, and there were some really troubling allegations of both physical and sexual abuse going on in the home. This relationship with Robert strained Francine's relationship with her children, who have already gone 9 months, without her while she was in jail awaiting trial. But with Robert around, it was really hard for Francine to be able to reconnect with her kids. Soon, Francine and Robert moved to Tennessee together, and Francine enrolled in nursing school and earned her certification as a licensed practical nurse. She started working in nursing homes and as a private caregiver for the elderly, and later the couple moved to Alabama.
When Francine was acquitted, the story gained national attention and shed light on the issue of domestic violence and the psychological effects of long-term abuse on victims and the extreme actions that they may take to escape their abuser. The case also led to a better understanding of Battered Woman Syndrome as a legitimate legal defense and also helped drive legal reforms that allowed for evidence of past abuse to be considered more seriously in court. It should be noted that the quote-unquote battered woman defense had critics who believed that it would encourage open season on husbands and lead to other women harming their spouses. But Francine disagreed because duh, they didn't say you can just start shooting your husband. Francine said, quote, "People blame me for creating an open season on husbands. How many men have killed their wives? Did anyone ever mention an open season on wives?" End quote.
Good point.
Very good point. So public awareness of domestic violence increased after Francine's case made headlines, and ultimately that awareness led to more support and resources for victims of domestic violence. More programs, shelters, and volunteers were becoming available, and education and prevention efforts started gaining traction. 2 years after she was acquitted, Francine's story was published in a biography by Faith McNulty called The Burning Bed, The True Story of an Abused Wife. 7 years later, the book was turned into a TV drama with the same name and starred Farrah Fawcett as Francine Hughes. Farrah Fawcett actually got an Emmy nomination. This was like a huge deal for her to have done this movie, and she did an incredible job. If you have a chance to watch it, I feel like it's on Lifetime.
I haven't yet. Yeah, I really want to find it and watch it. Now, I have never even heard of it, and like I didn't know it existed, so I definitely want to watch that one.
It's heartbreaking, but it's really well done. But man, it's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to see it, you know.
Yeah.
Despite the impact that the trial, book, and movie had on changing the conversation about domestic violence, Francine's acquittal is still the exception 50 years later. The majority of women who kill their abusive partners are not acquitted. And since the 1970s, the number of women in prison has increased dramatically, with many of those incarcerated women being victims of domestic violence. Laws that were created to help people defend themselves, like the Stand Your Ground law, often don't work in favor of women. In fact, we actually have a couple of other similar cases to share where things didn't work out in the favor of the abused.
And one example of that is the story of Ivy Gale Kelly, who shot and killed her husband on August 30th, 1980 in Snohomish County, Washington. Ivy claimed that her husband, who had been drinking heavily, had threatened to kill her and blocked her only exit from their house. So she pointed a gun at him just to scare him away, but it went off. During her trial, she testified about the abuse she endured and the repeated death threats that she received from her husband. An expert testified about Battered Woman Syndrome and how Ivy's experiences fit this pattern and led her to develop a state of helplessness where she felt trapped and genuinely in fear of her life when her husband made these threats, and she believed that there was no escape. Despite this defense, she was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In another case from 1994, Kathleen Weand was accused of first-degree murder after fatally shooting her husband Todd during a violent argument in their apartment. Kathleen also presented evidence to support Battered Woman Syndrome and testified about the abuse that she suffered at the hands of Todd all throughout their relationship. Experts testified that Kathleen did show signs of Battered Woman Syndrome, and that resulted in the perception that she was in immediate danger. But the jury found Kathleen guilty of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 18 years. In a more recent case from 2017, which is now 40 years after Francine's acquittal, Devin Gray shot and killed her boyfriend Barry Walsh during a domestic dispute in Calera, Alabama. Barry had a history of violence against Devin, and on the day of the shooting, he beat her so badly that she had broken bones in her face. When the police arrived, Devin was bleeding from the head, and multiple shots had been fired in the home by Barry before Devin shot him. But despite the state's Stand Your Ground law, the judge had doubts over whether or not Devin's life was actually in immediate danger at the time that she shot him. So she was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison.
And lastly, the case of Lorena Bobbitt became one of the most highly publicized legal battles of the 90s and renewed the public's attention on the issue of domestic violence. Most of us know how the story goes, but if you don't, on June 23rd, 1993, Lorena used a kitchen knife to cut her husband's penis off after he raped her. She claimed that her actions were brought on after years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of John Wayne Bobbitt. Her defense argued temporary insanity caused by the trauma of chronic abuse, and experts testified that she suffered from depression and PTSD, which impaired her ability to control her actions. She was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity and ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. As for Francine Hughes, she never thought of herself as any type of hero the way she was presented. She said, quote, "People still look at me like they're trying to figure me out. I don't feel like I have to explain myself to anybody, and I don't need pity or sympathy. I'm just an ordinary person," end quote. Francine passed away on March 22, 2017 in Sheffield, Alabama at the age of 69 after a bout with pneumonia. Her family spoke with the Lansing State Journal, and her granddaughter Molly said that Francine just had this upbeat demeanor and was so caring and loving and happy. Molly actually lived with Francine her whole life and said she didn't even find out what happened until she was 10 or 11 years old. Francine didn't feel like it was anything to be proud of and never felt justified. Molly said she thought her grandma kept it low-key because she felt ashamed and haunted by what happened. Francine's daughter Nicole added, quote, "She changed so many lives. She changed the lives of people she will never know," end quote. And some more resources for this story, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, NCADV. You can go to ncadv.org. They provide information, advocacy, and support for victims of domestic violence. There's also National Network to End Domestic Violence, NNEDV. Website is nnedv.org. And they also offer resources, advocacy, and support for victims of domestic violence. We have all of this will be in the show notes, so make sure you check that out. We also have on our website, momsandmysteries.com/DVA, where you can find a lot of this information. And also, during this month of October, we've teamed with the Navigating Advocacy podcast to create bags for domestic violence shelters. Again, this will all be in our show notes. There's even a link to a Google Doc that gives you tons of details. Of course, Haley, did an amazing job setting all that up. So it's everything. There's no question what you need. But the idea is you contact your local shelter and find out kind of what they need. Then you can create your own bag. It costs about $11 per bag, and then you donate it. And please let us know if you do this. Tag us on social media. We want to see as many bags out there as possible. Our friend Rose, she just recently did this with the shelter in her area, and it's just amazing to see people coming together and supporting something like this. So thank you guys.
Yes. Okay, that is the episode for this week. We will see you guys next week. Same time, same place, new story.
Have a great week.
Bye.